So it's 3:30. We will go ahead and get started. Welcome to the Communication Research Center's March Colloquium. My name is Michelle Amazine. I'm Director of the Communication Research Center and Associate Dean of Research at COM. Before we begin, I have a few housekeeping things for you. Please silence your phones, your laptops, any devices you may have so we don't distract those around you or interfere with the recording, which we are recording this event. If you're a student wishing to earn credit, be sure that you have checked in with our staff over there. And I do want to give credit and take a moment to thank our staff. So we have Amanda King, who is our lab and research manager, and Alyssa Hance is one of our graduate assistants, and Sean Mao as well. So thank you all for making this as soon as possible. Today, our colloquium speaker is Dr. AnneMarie McClain, who is an assistant professor of media science in the Department of Mass Communication, Advertising, and Public Relations. She received her PhD in communication arts from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Dr. McClain researches children's media, representation, and identity socialization. She has a particular focus on understanding how media and conversations around media can be used to promote positive outcomes for children and families, especially marginalized children and youth. Her recent studies have examined how U.S. Black families use media to socialize their children around identity, including after racism experiences. She consults for various children's media organizations and writes books for children with an anti-bias education lens. Her research has been published in academic journals such as Research in Human Development, the Journal of Children and Media, and the International Journal of Communication. Today, Dr. McClain will be drawing upon her program of research in her talk, Building Representation for Kids and Their Families, Theory and Practice. Please join me in welcoming Dr. AnneMarie McClain.
Thank you. All right, thank you so much for taking the time out to be here today. I'll give you an overview of what we're going to talk about today. So I'll give you a quick intro, and Dr. Amazine, thank you so much for that intro. Then we'll go over some theoretical grounding. We'll go over what kids' screen time in the US looks like. Then we'll bring families into the picture. After that, I will make a case for studying media uses and why that's important. We will look ahead at some of my ongoing work. We will do a little bit about educational consulting. I'll tell you what that looks like and give you some advice about how to integrate research and practice in the kids' media space. And then I'll leave some time for questions at the end. So again, a quick intro to myself. Again, I'm an assistant professor here at COM, and I'm teaching CM 180 this fall. I teach some of my students here. It's great to have you. And next year, I'll be launching a kids media class that will take graduate students and undergraduate students. I would love to have some of you there. And I want to give you some context about who I am so that you can understand how and why I approach things the way that I do. So before coming to BU, I was an elementary school teacher in New York City and rural Costa Rica. I taught kindergarten and first grade, and then kindergarten through second grade in Costa Rica, while also running a school theater production. I have several master's degrees, including from CUNY Hunter about childhood education, as well as a degree in human development and psychology from the Harvard Graduate School of Education. I have a PhD in communication arts from UW-Madison, specializing in media uses and effects, family communication, and child development with a focus on identity. I also have experience working at the intersection of research and practice. So for example, as part of a research team at Tufts University, partnering with GBH Boston, we designed and evaluated a series of social emotional learning and character digital games for elementary school kids based on the television show Arthur. As I'll talk about later, I am a kids book author and an educational and DEI consultant for several big players in the children's media space, including GBH, Imagine, and Cartoon Network. In terms of my research focus, my area of research comes out of my life experiences, my applied and interdisciplinary backgrounds, and my commitment to promote well-being among marginalized children and their families. In my work, I connect theories and empirical research in the domains of media uses and effects, family communication, and child development, focusing the bulk of my work on one central question. How can media be designed and used to help marginalized kids thrive? And in large part, what I do with my work specifically is take an asset-based, agentic, theory-informed perspective that looks not only at how individuals make media choices and why, but how minoritized families are doing this with and for their children, specifically around identity. Most of my work to date has centered US Black families. Their experiences are unique, and it's a critical population for this kind of work. You can think about calls for representation around George Floyd's death, the global response to his death, the systemic longstanding stereotypes in media, and the perpetuation of racism in this country. And a large part of what I do is try to understand how parents stand in the gap between bias, devastating events, and hardships, and their children. So I'm deeply committed to understanding how families are managing and interpreting, protecting, and educating their children for the world that they live in and how it could be better, and how families and kids can be partners in their own media representation. So now we'll get to some theoretical grounding. You can put your hands up in the air, please, if you've ever heard the phrase representation matters. So there are lots of calls for identity representation in media. But what is the theoretical grounding that shows us that it's important? There are several theories that come into play. One of them is social cognitive theory. If we boil down this theory, its basic big idea is that individuals don't have to directly experience something to learn about it or to learn from it. We can learn by observing others. It's about vicarious learning. And when applied to the mass media context, it means that we can learn by observing others from consuming media. And importantly, identification. So how similar models are in the representation to us likely plays a role in people's likelihood of copying behavior or the learning that's in that content. Now, there isn't much work using social cognitive theory to explore how marginalized kids might learn from on-screen media when their identities are featured. And there's especially limited work applying the theory to look at positive outcomes. So for example, positive role models of the same identity, positive behaviors of similar behavior modeled. But there is important evidence about risky behavior. So in this study that I'm highlighting here, Leakley et al. In 2017, they ran a survey where they asked US Black teens to report how frequently they consumed Black risky movie content. They determined what content was Black oriented and how risky it was by a content analysis. And the Black oriented media they defined as content that really featured Black stars as the main characters, and it focused on racial issues. And then they asked teens to report the frequency of their own risky behaviors, as defined by alcohol use, physical fighting, and sex. And what they found was that US Black teens, those reported risky behaviors, those rates, those were tied to their rates of exposure to Black-oriented movies with risky content. But those reported behaviors were unrelated to their exposure to risky mainstream movies that didn't feature predominantly Black casts and that didn't feel focused on predominantly racialized issues. And this is important because it shows the power of representation. And it's important also because it brings up this question about how social cognitive theory could be used to robustly examine the positive effects of exposure to same identity role models. Then there's this theory called the theory of invisibility. And the theory of invisibility is another major player in the world of representation, though this theory has been tested even less than social cognitive theory in terms of representation for kids. So it proposes that basically when you don't see yourself or when you don't see representations of a group, that is also a socializing message. So it says that when we have an absence of plentiful, holistic, diverse, positive portrayals, or in other words, invisibility, that can socialize youth and adults. And invisibility is anticipated to affect in-group and out-group views and attitudes and how people think they can or can't navigate different environments. And they propose that invisibility can take two different forms. Absolute invisibility, when you cannot see your group represented at all, and relative invisibility, when you can see your group in some ways, but it might be really stereotyped or in a really specific set of roles. Again, there is very limited work about this, but available evidence shows that Indigenous teens' exposure to stereotypical Indigenous portrayals, so Chief Wahoo, which is the former mascot of the Cleveland baseball team, and Pocahontas, a Disney character portrayed in the Disney character, that was the stimuli, that exposure to those images had Indigenous high schoolers reporting lower self-esteem compared to Indigenous high schoolers who were in a control condition and did not have exposure to those images. Cultivation theory is another theory that's relevant, and you've probably heard of cultivation theory. Its big idea is that heavy, habitual consumption of mainstream media leads to cumulative, gradual effects. Because of the common story that mainstream media tell, heavy habitual exposure to it is proposed to override individual differences and lead people to see the world in the same ways, and in the ways that they're shown on TV, for example. So this means if there are stereotypes and limited portrayals of particular groups, this is what might get absorbed into the psyche. And now we can critique cultivation theory's relevance in today's times, but I'd argue that it's still a prime contender when thinking about representation, because even though there's more content now, and even though how we consume it is different, a lot of the same people and the same organizations make the content or own the content. And it's possible that the same tropes are going to be present in them because of that. So again, limited work has been done with kids' representation from marginalized groups and cultivation theory, but here's a study with some findings that we should care about. Martins and Harrison found through a survey that pre-adolescent white and Black children's exposure to television had some differing effects. So high rates of television exposure predicted lower global self-esteem among Black boys, Black girls, and white girls, but not white boys. So in line with cultivation theory, perhaps because of the likely stereotypes and limited representations of girls and Black children that are shown, this is important information. Then there's the parasocial contact hypothesis. This is based on Alport's contact hypothesis, and it proposes that we form relationships with media characters and personae. So by building relationships with out-group others, including via exposure through media, which is the premise of the parasocial contact hypothesis, that this may reduce prejudicial attitudes and behaviors. So here's a study that I want to highlight. In this study, 112 undergrads were involved in a longitudinal experiment. And even though this study was done with college students, I'm highlighting it because it's one of the most rigorous tests of the parasocial contact hypothesis to date. They found that straight participants formed parasocial relationships with gay characters from a television show, and that those parasocial relationships grew over time. Those parasocial relationships predicted reduced prejudice among straight participants. So it's important because it raises questions about what might be possible about reducing the prejudices of children with long-term exposure to characters via parasocial relationships, including with LGBTQ+ characters. So now that we've talked about some of the theoretical grounding for understanding why representation matters and highlighting some of the work that is to be done, Let's turn to why it's important for another reason: how much screen time kids are consuming. This can help us understand how much we should be concerned. Data from Common Sense Media, who are giants in being able to do important nationally representative work around kids and families and media, found that among US 0 to 8-year-olds, 65% of them are consuming 2 or more hours of screen time a day. And there are some differences by race. Black children are consuming over 2 hours more screen time than white children at this age, and over 1 hour more than Latinx children at this age. Among US 8 to 18-year-olds, tweens are consuming over 5 hours of daily entertainment media use. Teens, over 8 hours of daily entertainment media use. Black youth consuming more than white youth, and Latin youth consuming more than white youth as well. And you might be curious about what they're doing with their time. Here's a breakdown from Common Sense Media as well, and you could just take a minute to look at that information. And as what you can see here is that television and online videos are still holding the championship title here. So with these media trends, and with some differences existing by race and ethnicity, I want to highlight this study. So in this study, Ellie Thorpe and Bleakley analyzed Nielsen rating data from broadcast and cable shows from September 22nd, 2014 through June 28th, 2015. And they were focusing on US teens. And I'm highlighting their findings about US Black youth. So they found that US Black youth were consuming the same 100 top shows as their white peers. They were watching the same stuff as white adolescents. But then they were also watching an additional 155 shows. And what's really important is that those additional 155 shows had higher rates of ethnic racial representation. So that's important because it suggests that one of the reasons why Black and maybe other youth of color may have higher rates of media consumption is because they're looking for content that represents them. And they have to consume additional content to get that representation while also keeping up with their peers and what's relevant for kids their age in other ways. Let's bring families into the picture now. What do they think about representation? Again, we can turn to nationally representative data from Common Sense Media. This study found that parents are concerned about stereotypes in their kids' media when they have kids ages 0 to 8. 53% reported being very or somewhat concerned about the racial or ethnic stereotypes in their kids' media. 49% reported being very or somewhat concerned about gender stereotypes in their kids' media. And Black and Latin parents were almost twice as likely as white parents to report being very concerned about gender and racial ethnic media stereotypes. Importantly, the finding that ethnically racially minoritized US families are concerned about stereotypes tracks with what we know about child identity socialization practices. So there's this construct called ethnic racial socialization. And it basically refers to how families teach and talk to their kids about ethnic racial identity. This work has been concentrated in developmental psychology and mostly has focused on interpersonal messages that don't involve media. But this work suggests that there might be a need among minoritized families for content that features pride and cultural representation, as well as content to help prepare their child for bias. So in this study of mine that I'll highlight, I wanted to describe Black parents, how they use media to teach and talk to their kids about race. So we asked parents questions about how they socialize their kids around race and ethnicity generally, not using media. And then we wanted to know how much they were socializing their kids and in what ways around media use in general. So were they socializing them to encouraging them to watch pro-social educational content and restricting their access to morally wrong and violent content? And then we wanted to ask how they socialized around race and ethnicity, so how they used media racial depictions to socialize. This study involved 398 Black parents of Black children. So here's what those media racial depiction items looked like. So we asked parents how often, if ever, they engage in the following kinds of practices. How often, for example, they use media to help their child feel positive, for example, by encouraging them to see and hear media portrayals with positive portrayals of Black Americans. We also asked how often they use media to help their child prepare for bias, for example, to discuss the ways that your kid should handle the types of bias shown. And then we asked about how often they critiqued negative and stereotyped depictions about their race, and how often they restricted access to that kind of content. We found that parents were engaging in interpersonal, non-media conversations with their children about race, as had been found in plenty of other literature. And we also found that parents were engaging in ways to guide their kids' educational and positive exposure to content, and to critique and restrict access to violence and morally wrong content, again, as expected from plenty of other literature. But what was newer was that we found specific strategies that US Black parents reported engaging in to actively guide and discuss their kids' media around racial representation. So strategies around using media to help the child feel good or seen about their identity, as well as ways to help the child grow around their identity and be prepared for racism, both of which track with a theory that I'll mention in a few moments. And finally, I want to highlight this in the context of talking about families and media. So there's another important study examining parent strategies around identity in media, specifically highlighting the dangers in negative representation. Rana et al. Conducted interviews with Sikh parents about their socialization strategies around identity. Families reported that because of negative media coverage of Muslims, that they feared for their child's safety and encouraged them to avoid wearing cultural markers that would signal their identity in order to keep them safe. So these parents were socializing their kids because of the negative identity portrayals that existed out there. And it's serious because people should be allowed to express who they are. Now I want to make a case for media use. In the beginning of this lecture, we talked about theorizing related to media effects. And I've shown you some evidence about media effects. But now I'm going to pivot to talk about media uses. Many theoretical frameworks propose that media effects are in part related to the kind of media consumed and how they're used, among other factors. My idea is, and why I'm making a case for it being so important to study media uses among marginalized kids and their families, is because I care about using media for good. And to be able to run rigorous tests and to see what positive effects can arise from representation, we need to know what kind of content is considered positive or useful. We need to know how to make content that we can test effects of. The theories that I presented earlier hopefully make some intuitive sense. They say things like, seeing people with a shared identity is helpful and affirming representation is good. But identity is complex, and what kids and families need might depend on their particular identities, circumstances, and context. And there's a lot of work to do to see what that kind of content might look like. To date, we know really hardly anything about what marginalized youth and their families find affirming and useful. But there's a theory that can be used as an initial base for theory testing and building to help us move forward. The selective exposure, self and affect management model has its roots in multiple theories, including mood management theory and social identity theory. In particular, CSAM suggests that media selections can be affected by affect and arousal. So we generally want to feel positive affect rather than negative affect. And we want a positive level of arousal, not too much and not too little. But CSAM also suggests that media selections can be affected by social identity motivations. Specifically, there is self-consistency, which is the default motivation, where people are expected to look for content that helps them feel seen for who they are, content where they might see the same beliefs and attitudes that they have reflected back to them. Then there's self-enhancement, which is expected in response to an identity threat. And here, people are expected to look for content that is ego-enhancing to help them feel better about their identity. And then there's self-improvement, which is expected in response to an identity threat, an identity need, and where people might select discordant content, but content that can help them learn or grow or adapt in some way. In recent work, I suggested that these identity-related needs, motivations, may actually map onto the developmental psychology literature about how families teach and talk to their kids about race. For self-consistency, a parent trying to instill self-consistency in their child might want their kid to consume content that helps them see themselves as they see themselves. For self-enhancement, they might want to help the child feel better and uplifted or inspired about their identity. And then for self-improvement, they might be looking to help their child grow or adapt or improve or develop, including around preparation for bias. I'll talk about a study that I ran where I explored the questions of what types of content Black parents would want their child to see in their entertainment media and at what frequencies, and how they might map on to the CSAM motivation. So 310 Black parents of Black children ages 3 to 17 took an online survey. I asked them how frequently they wanted their kids to see various character depictions, storylines, and racism depictions. I asked about a slew of depictions, but these are some of the key findings. I want to highlight that parents wanted to see high rates of unambiguous, clear Black representation over ambiguous and metaphorical depictions. They also wanted to see high rates of everyday Black life representation. So Black kids playing with Black friends and Black people having everyday experiences at school and at work. Both of these, which may be consistent with CSAM's self-consistency motivation. They also wanted to see high rates of racial pride content. So high rates, for example, of Black characters discussing Black pride, culture, and history. And this seems consistent with CSAM's self-enhancement motivation. And then parents also wanted to see high rates of contemporary racism content, which is consistent with the idea that Black parents have other identity-related needs for their kids, including around self-improvement. So they wanted to see high rates of contemporary racism, and they wanted to see that more than historical depictions of racism and slavery, for example. They also wanted to see racism that was called out and punished. Overall, Black parents had these preferences regardless of their kids' age. So these preferences did not vary by child age. Parents of preschoolers and parents of high schoolers wanted the same content at the same rates for their kids, including content about racism. But even though these preferences were reported, there's a lot more we can do and a lot more we can find out. One of the things that we can be concerned with is, what do parents actually select in the moment for their kids? Do they really pick explicitly racial pride content? And might situational factors matter, such as when a kid comes home and tells their parent that they experienced racism? Might that experience serve as an impetus to select racial pride content or even contemporary racism content? CSAM can help inform prediction, because it predicts that identity threat and identity-related needs should predict exposure to race-related content. With these questions and these this impetus in mind, I designed an online experiment with about 500 Black parents of Black children with these ages 3 to 5, ages 9 to 11, and ages 15 to 17. So I'll walk you through that design and the findings. First, parents were randomly assigned a vignette in which they were asked to imagine one of the following situations: an okay day for their kid with their peers, or a day where their kid experienced racism from their peers. And here you can see the vignettes for the younger children, the parents of younger children, ages 3 to 5 and 9 to 11. And the racism vignette on the right is designed to simulate an experience of threat. I asked parents how much they thought their kid would feel bad and how much they'd worry about their child facing racial bias after reading their vignette. As you can see, the manipulation worked. Parents in the racism condition thought that their kid would feel more bad, and they reported being more worried about bias, even though parents in the okay day condition also reported being worried about bias for their kids. After they looked at the vignette, I gave them 4 choices of media content to select. And here are some of the options for parents of preschoolers. One was a show that represented a way of mending mood by way of an unrelated, happy, upbeat show, a show that might seem intuitively appealing to a sad kid. It's possible that there could be high levels of this choice preference in the racism condition, and certainly theories focused on mood and arousal, like Zillman's mood management theory, would predict this. Another choice was an option that could also potentially mend mood by way of a positive, fun, and identity-related show, akin to CSAM's self-enhancement. We might expect this choice to be higher in the racism condition, even more than the okay day condition. Then there was an option for facing racism head on. So addressing racial bias directly with mixed valence content, akin to CSAM's self-improvement. And the question was, would the selection odds for this choice actually be higher in the racism condition? Zillman's theorizing would say no, but CSAM might say yes. And then one might expect that when a kid has an okay day, parents might be willing to have their kid watch something not upbeat, but that would give them other benefits, such as information about climate change. Parents might feel like their kid is more able to expand out to other types of content when their identity is not under threat. All parents watched a series of 4 trailers for shows targeted to their kids' age. I gave parents this prompt before they watched, asking them to watch at regular speed, to think about the whole show when answering questions, and to think about the situation that they had read in the vignettes that they were given. So I'm going to show you a little bit about what the trailers looked like. There were different options for the different age groups, and I'm going to focus on some of the ones targeted for 3 to 5-year-olds. So I want to note that these were all about 30 seconds. I pre-tested them, and parents were randomly assigned to one of 2 sets of stimuli. So it's not just specific to the particular clip. These choices were similar regardless of which happy, distracting ones they were offered, and so on. So here's an example of a fun, positive, identity-related show that might be ego-enhancing. And now I'll show you an option for facing racism head on, again, targeted at 3 to 5-year-olds. And now, lastly, I will top this off with an unrelated, happy, upbeat show about an Australian family of dogs, which is one of my favorite shows, and you should watch it if you have time. Okay, so what did parents choose? So the biggest key finding that I want to highlight is that parents did select race-related content, even content with racism for their kids, even when they reported that their kid would be feeling negatively about the racial incident. So here's a bar chart that shows the distribution of parents by condition. The non-racial shows, so the entertainment, positive, distracting, and the climate change are grouped together. And what we can see here from chi-square analysis are selection differences by condition. So here, compared to the OK day condition, parents in the racism condition were less likely to select the non-racial entertainment or climate change shows. We can also see that compared to the OK day condition, parents in the racism condition were more likely to select the racial pride content. And lastly, we can see that parents in the racism condition were more likely to select the racism video than parents in the OK day condition. So the main takeaway from this parent study is that parents were leaning into using media to address race with their kid following an upsetting racism incident, despite feeling upset by the racism experience. So this adds support to CSAM, which predicts that an identity-related need or threat is going to trigger the selection of affirming identity-related content, for example, racial pride content, or discordant growth identity-related content, even if that content is mixed valence, no vicarious racism. And it shows that CSAM has applicability in the parental mediation space around identity in marginalized families. Then I ran a parallel study with teens. So I was interested in what kids would pick for themselves after they are in a racism experience. So 520 US Black teens ages 13 to 17. I used the same stimuli for teens that I had in the parent study, and I can show you what some of those are if there's time. You could ask me to see them later. So same structure. What did teens choose? Compared to the OK day condition, teens in the racism condition were less likely to select the non-racial content. So this is the same pattern that Black parents showed. We can also see that compared to the OK day condition, Black teens in the racism condition were more likely to select the racial pride content. However, compared to the OK day condition, teens in the racism condition were not significantly more likely to select the racism show. This is different than what I found in the parent data. In both conditions, about a quarter of Black teens sought out the vicarious racism show. It might be that content with vicarious racism is important to teens regardless of what happens to them in a day, whether they've experienced racism or not. Black parents and teens may have different ideas about what's useful following a racism experience for the kid, and both perspectives are important to consider. Because of this conflicting data, I'm wanting to know more about why they made the choices they did, in addition to my desire to work to amplify voices that have historically been excluded. I turned to open-ended data to try to explain what might be going on. We know what they picked, and in theory, it's because they experienced an identity threat, an identity-related need, but what do they say about what they picked and why they picked it? Among parents, oh, I just want to shout out to two RAs from Williams College who've done a lot of the coding for this. I want to give them a shout out. So here's what we found among parents. So these are the themes that emerged. What we found among parents is that we found some CSAM aligned gratifications that emerged. So we found evidence of self-improvement by way of parents reporting that they were looking to show their kid about the reality of racism and about how to cope with racism. And we also found some evidence of self-enhancement aligned gratifications, motivations, racial pride and self-esteem. And you can read some of those quotes there. But we also found other themes that don't seem like they really fit with CSAM necessarily, including around culture, heritage, and history, managing mood, racial equality, education, the desire for representation in terms of having a shared experience with a character. You can take a minute to read some of the quotes, but to me, these suggest that CSAM provides a good base for understanding motivations for identity-related media selection. And we have evidence that it can explain some of the processes involved in this selective exposure, but there may be something more going on. These themes are possibly more aligned with uses and gratifications theory or social identity gratification, both of which are criticized for being too vague and not falsifiable. But it's important because this data comes from people's own voices. It's also important because we found the same patterns among teens. So among teens, you can take a minute here to read some of these quotes. Again, found some CSAM aligned motivations. An interesting thing happening here with what had been happening with cultural socialization here, talking about culture and history and heritage here. And with teens, they're also talking about using media to understand who they are. So a next step for me is to analyze whether these themes are mutually exclusive, if parents and teens have different rates of these themes coming up in their responses, if they vary by condition or by show selected, and if people picked the same show for different gratification, which would align with some propositions from uses and gratifications theory. So this all suggests that more theory building is needed, so I will be working on that. And then I just want to highlight that teens also had some other things come up in their responses. So they reported using media for inspiration and proactive action. So being inspired to act, using media to support others, and environmental justice. So with this data, I'd like to say the kids are all right, and there's more work to be done. So to close the loop here about why media uses are so important to study, it's because they can help us test theory. So they let us know what to ask about, what's relevant. They can guide our stimuli creation in the world of media representation. And they can help us build theory, and they can help us do ecologically relevant work. And they can also help us amplify voices and lived experiences. So looking ahead, I'll tell you a little bit more about some other exciting areas of work that I'm doing. So I'm working with 2 LGBTQ+ youth organizations and a kids media industry expert to launch focus groups to ask about the marginalized kids and families of a different identity, so gender expansive families. So what they want to see in kids media, how they use media for identity, and why they use media for identity. And I'll see if CSAM is able to explain their motivations and their gratification. And shout out here to 2 of my grad student RAs who are doing a wonderful job helping me design this study. And then I'm also working on a picture book content analysis. So I'm examining what implicit and explicit ethnic racial socialization messages are in the most popular recommended kids books about race and racism. So I'm analyzing 200 picture books with my wonderful team of RAs, 2 grad students and 2 undergrads, to be able to figure out what's in these books. We're looking at things about which books talk about vicarious racism explicitly, which books explicitly feature racial pride. And then the idea is to be able to then use those books, once we know which ones have racial pride about this particular group, or which ones feature racism about that particular group, then we can use those as stimuli in experiments, and we can use those in observational work to see how families and kids are talking about them and what happens when they're exposed to that. And that will be related to this work here. I'll be doing family observations in the future of media selections and conversations, again, using CSAM and potential uses and gratification theory, along with ethnic racial socialization theorizing. And I'll be recruiting RAs for that. And now I'm going to turn to educational consulting. So I'm going to just tell you a little bit about what I do for educational consulting, so you have a little bit of sense of what that can look like if that's something you're interested in. So I've worked with several media organizations that focus on children, and a lot of the material is protected by NDAs, so I can't be very specific about specific details, but here's an outline of things that I've done. So I review scripts and outlines for television. I review prototypes and beta versions and alphas of educational games. These are both with DEI and educational focuses. I have developed curriculum for a television show with DEI and social emotional learning objectives in mind. I've created family-facing DEI content. I've advised on an NSF grant proposal and an NSF-funded project, and I advise on formative evaluation materials. And then my educational consulting work brought me into the space of kids media. So I was asked to co-author two children's book series about social identities and varied lived experiences. So one of them is about topics to talk about, and the other one is about loved ones who have different lived experiences, so Down syndrome and chronic illnesses and different varieties of that. And then sometimes I get asked how I got to be able to do this work. And the first way that I got to do it is by doing research. So it's really, really important. It's really true. If people say that to you, it can really, really get you into applied spaces. So specifically, this the Black Parental Hope study that I presented on, I turned that into an industry-facing report and an executive summary with an infographic, because I was told by a content executive, do not send us like a 30-page document, like make it short and understandable and digestible. And so I did that, and then I sent that out to media contacts, and my network sent it out to media contacts. And so that helped people understand the kind of work that I do. And then I want to say by interning. So the students in the room, it can really, really make a difference. Last year, I got a LinkedIn message from my former internship, one of my former internship bosses at GBH saying, I saw your name on a list, and would you be interested in doing this thing? I remember you as an intern. So it really can make a difference. And it's really awesome to have so many great opportunities here at BU and in Boston. And then the other way is just by talking to news outlets. And then to close, I want to highlight some tips for combining research and practice. So one tip that I have for everyone in the room is to ask people what they need and want. So even if it doesn't always look or sound like the most traditional academic scholarship, it's really, really important. And it's one of the foundations of community engaged scholarship. And it's a really important way to amplify and leverage voices. So sometimes you have to build theory from the ground up. Sometimes it's important to remember that the theories that exist weren't always made with marginalized communities in mind. So it's our job to build theory based on what we find is true for their realities. And the kids media industry seems really interested in this kind of data. And then making research accessible and tangible. So doing things like industry reports and infographics I found has been really, really helpful. And then partnering. So partnering specifically in the kids media space, partnering with kids media industry folks to be able to design high quality stimuli, be able to design content that you can formatively evaluate. So students in my class know about formative evaluation. This is when you are testing content that's in development, and then you're seeing what's working, what's not, what's landing, what is making no sense to kids. And then you're able to go back and iteratively design it, which makes your stimuli and your content stronger. So having really good high quality stimuli can mean that you can have really rigorous experiments and different studies that you can run. And then it's really important to partner with kids and families and their communities. So one thing I'll highlight that's becoming really recommended and really popular is to have kids be, for example, or families be on advisory boards. So if you're doing a study or if you're doing a partnership, having people advise on the content and on what's happening is a really well-respected approach. And then for the students in the room who are undergrads, and master's students, you can consider getting a PhD. So I want to highlight here, these are the credits from some really amazing shows that run on PBS. And you can see that there's a lot of PhDs listed in the who's doing the advising, who's doing the curriculum consulting. And here, some of these folks have PhDs, but they're not listed. And then finally, I want to say just to do what you love. So you'll be most successful if you do what you love, follow your gut, follow your interests, and it will lead you where you're supposed to be. And that's it. Anybody?
I don't agree. Very much for active, prevention. It's really fascinating. The things about children, not how. Their case, which is meant to do that approach, and what might be features that it considered to take the that selection.
Sorry, I didn't hear the last part of your question. To keep the selection? Oh, do you mean to keep the gender representation? Is that what you mean? Yeah, okay. Yeah, so it's a really, really good question. So for a long time, I've wanted to bring families. So again, a lot of my work focuses on US Black families. So I've wanted for a long time to bring US Black families into a lab space to give them, for example, a picture book and to say, you know, what happens when they are talking to their kid about race by reading that picture book. And what are the effects of that conversation and how is the kid interacting, et cetera. But it's really, really hard for me to do that work because I don't know which books to give them. So if I want to know what happens when I give a Black parent a book about Black racial pride, I need to know what books objectively feature Black racial pride. So that's where this study comes in, where I'm figuring out basically what my stimuli are for that study. In terms of getting representation in terms of gender and socioeconomic status, it'll be hard to do something like this. And so what it takes on the back end is building relationships. So getting involved in community organizations and getting involved in schools, which I'm beginning to do, and building relationships as somebody who's trusted and who's willing to do community engaged work to give back to the communities who are offering their time. And then also, what I would plan to do is I would plan to bring people in mutually like symbiotic relationships. Like, what are people interested in? What do they think is relevant? And then to have them potentially help me get to their networks, and then really showing that, you know, I'm trying to do things that are helpful for everyone and trying to be really responsive. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Other questions? You have 7 minutes.
Yeah, so wonderful presentation. Thank you so much for sharing. So I'm sure you're familiar with the Bandura Bobo doll experiment, which receives criticism somewhat in part because of bringing children to a lab space. And you just mentioned that with the picture book study, you're hoping to bring parents and their children to a lab space. Have you considered doing that observation in their home?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So my answer to that would be that I would respond to what the community is saying. If people are saying, please don't come into our homes, then I would do it in a lab. So people, from my experience, have mixed feelings. So some people do not want researchers in their homes. And so home-based studies can be really beautifully done if they're welcomed and if that's what the particular community is asking and respecting. But of course, there is more ecological validity if you go to someone's home. So it's risky, but I think when in doubt, you defer to the community that you're working with.
Well, there's another study. I mean, you could do both.
Yeah.
Wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. It taught me to think a lot about my media choice, about what type of movies and YouTubers that I follow. I have a question related to the new media. This from the early surveys that you presented, besides traditional television, there's also kind of amount of new, and then kids are watching having their exposure to the online. So I was wondering. And also you talked about like whole social benefits coming from videos. Right? So I was wondering if this could be counterintuitive impact from algorithm and how would that expose kids, no matter as minority kids or non-minority kids, to larger diverse content.
Yeah.
Because again, like I watch a lot of YouTube that's like or transnational, like looking at how people their experiences in a different country of
Yeah.
origin. And I got, like feeded by so many similar videos.
Yeah.
And that prompted me into like a lot more culture exposures.
Yeah. I
wondered if algorithm may actually play a beneficial
Yeah.
role to
Yeah, sounds like a wonderful research study to do. Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's so one of the takeaways that I want you all to have is that there's so much work to be done, and we know we seriously know almost nothing. And so all of these things need to be addressed, and keeping up with what kids are doing and how they're doing it and how companies are responding with algorithms, all of that needs to be studied. So it's a really important, all of it's important, and it all needs to be done. But to do strong work, it's also really important to be incremental and tight with the studies that you build. So, yeah. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you so much. If anyone wants to follow up, definitely email me. Happy to do.